Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. I'm Dana Stangel-Plow, Chief Program Officer at Navi. Since you're here with us today, you know that our nation's classrooms have become politicized. Navi's mission is to restore American civic values and to counter illiberal ideologies in K-12 education. Today's topic is Upstream Activism, how teachers, colleges shape K-12 classrooms. When we say upstream, we're talking about the forces at work that are outside the classroom that flow into the classroom and shape what children and how children are learning. So this is the second webinar in a series of conversations that we're presenting around the release of our new white paper, which you can download at navivalues.org/hostile classroom. In the white paper, we argue that rising extremism and anti-Semitism in our nation's schools stem from the systemic ideological capture of America's education institutions, everything from teachers' unions to teachers' colleges, state accreditation and licensure rules, to school boards and professional development and curriculum. So teachers, colleges, and teacher development are really at the center of the problem and the solutions. It's a daunting and complex problem, and I'm very grateful to have our experts here today to help us make sense of it all. Thank you to Brandy and Lyle and Daniel for being here. And if you would, let's get started by having you all introduce yourselves. Just tell us a little bit about your background and your work in this area. Brandy, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Dana, and it's really great to be here with you, Daniel and Lyle. So I'm currently the Director of Education and National Security with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I got started really looking into education work when I went back to school, actually for a change in career, and I attended a school of education to get my doctorate in international and multicultural education. And I was astounded by the ideology that was being taught to future and current teachers and curriculum developers in the K through 12 education space. I thought that during my program, that teachers and curriculum developers were going to be given examples and tools and resources to create better, more well-rounded students, to increase scholarship and high quality academics. And instead of that, I saw a trend where there was dogma being pushed, replacing scholarship. And so I started out working with Navi, the wonderful people there, which I'm still proud to sit on the board of, and moved into my newer role with FDD just more recently.
I can go next. Yeah. Daniel Buck. I'm currently with the American Enterprise Institute. Spent just under a decade as both a teacher and assistant principal in the schools. But in all of my time doing that, and all my time writing, and all of my time doing speaking events like this, I'm often joked that my whole career has just been an argument with my teachers' college. I think I share similar experiences where I went there expecting to learn how to run a classroom, how to manage behaviors, how to write good tests, how to run group discussions and plan out homework and sequence units and all these kinds of things. And that's not what I got. We spent our time basically getting a degree in far left politics, not even kind of center left politics, but very fringe ideologies, kind of neo-Marxist ideologies. We spent time sitting in friendship circles, passing around talking sticks, talking about our feelings. We made Black Lives Matter friendship bracelets during our capstone course. You know, whatever your thoughts are on that movement, like what were we doing in a teacher's college where we should have just been talking about classroom practice? So kind of I've been trying to bang this drum and draw attention to the schools of education ever since my experience there, which was at best worthless and at worst, actively teaching both hostile ideologies, to use the word from your report, and counterproductive kind of instructional theories too, just ineffective ones.
My name is Lyle Asher, and I come at this from a slightly different direction. I didn't attend an ed school and honestly didn't think much about them until I suppose it was around 2010. up to that point, I'd been teaching English very happily at Lewis and Clark College, and before that at the University of Oregon. I had gotten my PhD at the University of Virginia, and I ran into E.D. Hirsch. I didn't have him as a teacher, but I ran into him at a party once. He was very gracious to come to a party thrown by a graduate student friend of mine. No one expected him to show up, and there he was. And I remember in retrospect now, probably 20 years, 30 years later, that he was just then talking about one of the things that he had discovered, which was that reading wasn't just a matter of decoding, but also comprehending. And if you didn't have what he called cultural literacy, there was no comprehension. So reading tests weren't really just testing reading. He told me at this party, I'll never forget, they were really testing core knowledge. Well, I knew Hirsch had, in some ways, changed his career path. He'd been a great professor of English and written wonderful books, but he devoted the rest of his career, and still, I think, is thinking about it in his 90s, to reforming schools. Well, it was only in 2010 that all this came back to me, because I noticed something was changing at not only my college, but other colleges. And what had changed was an influx of administrators. And we'd always had administrators, but they were making strange noises, saying odd things that I'd never heard before. And to be frank, creating lots of problems where there were none, at least in the magnitude that they were suggesting. And they were continued to create these problems, and I finally had had enough and began challenging them. And at that time, way back in 2010, other faculty members challenged them as well. To wrap it up, I then began writing about what I discovered. And what I discovered was that just about every single administrator that was causing problems had gotten a degree from an ed school. And that began my sort of writing journey on the question of ed schools and how ed schools have derailed higher education, though higher education bears a significant part of the responsibility for that.
Thanks. Yeah, I also attended an ed school in around 2014. I have to say I was pleased at my first year's experience there. We were given a big range of thinkers to study and to think about our own classroom practice, including E.D. Hirsch's work, which I hadn't heard of before and very much spoke to me. But by the second year, we were shoulder deep in Judith Butler and gender theory, and I realized that wasn't really going to help me teach reading or writing, and I actually left the program. So for people who don't follow this issue closely, I think maybe we should clarify what we mean by education schools, what they are, what their purpose they're meant to serve is, and what is actually happening there now.
I mean, I think when we think about an education school or a teacher's college or an education department, a school of education, we're talking about the profession of teachers, schools that provide or supposed to provide the foundations for that profession. So if you're going in to teach, whether it's, elementary, middle, or high school, there are certain things you need to learn how to do. Recognize a student with a learning challenge or learning advantage. Recognize that different learning styles. So if you need to craft your curriculum, your lessons for students who are more visual, students who are more hands-on, learn how to manage a classroom of a couple dozen students that are coming from different backgrounds. Those are the typical, and more, but those are like the typical foundational things necessary for the profession of teaching, of educating. So when we look at education schools and what they're providing today, I mean, I would dare to say they're providing none of those things. And it's not just based on, say, my experience or maybe Daniel's experience, your experience, data, but it's also based on teachers who are realizing that they were actually not provided the tools necessary to do their job, to do their profession. Instead of learning how to teach kids how to read phonetically, they were learning Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which doesn't teach a kid how to read. And so when we're thinking about education schools, it's really looking at teaching as being an educator as a profession, and the professional educational setting that's supposed to provide them with the foundations necessary to carry out that profession.
And I think a bit of, you guys, what are these ed schools? A very brief history might also help us kind of understand what they are and how they got to this point. Many of these started as normal schools, which were just in addition, one more year after high school for anyone who wanted to go and become a teacher at the time, late 1800s, early 1900s, mostly women. Getting an extra year of schooling, making sure they kind of had their history and science known, and getting some basic kind of just tips and tricks for running the one-room schoolhouse, some basic training there. These got absorbed over time into universities. And that happened when the 20th century progressives were kind of at their zenith. Yeah, when at their highest point. So John Dewey and others like him were kind of in vogue at the time. So there's kind of this historical accident where right as these normal schools were becoming schools of education, university institutions, John Dewey and kind of his acolytes were also most popular. So from the beginning, these schools of education were bought into a progressive view of education that there isn't really a body of knowledge that kids should know, that anything like rules or curriculum or structure is kind of oppressive to them, or at best just ineffective. And that kind of has been the predominant dogma, to use a word that Brandy was using, of these schools of education since then. And Dana, it sounds like your experience where you even encountered E.D. Hirsch is something of an outlier. If these schools of education are teaching anything that whiffs of traditional instruction, or dare I say something like classical education, it's typically as this is the old way. This is, we have advanced past that. There's kind of this professional jealousy where I think the schools of education look at the science departments and they want to have something as abstract and theoretical or academic, and so they come up with these esoteric theories to kind of justify their own existence instead of focusing on what we know works. Phonics, kids sitting and practicing their math facts, that doesn't really give the prestige that a professor looks for. So they're always going after the latest fad, the latest theory to justify their own existence.
Yeah, let's relate. I was going to ask you, Lyle, to relate what Daniel's talking about back to what you observed on your campus and how that relates to ed schools.
Well, I just wanted to add to what Daniel and Brandy said by just taking us up from the sort of the progressive movement with people like George Counts, in addition to John Dewey. And to my mind, the biggest and proximate source, although everything that's been said is exactly right, the proximate source for the current problem is the Vietnam War period, I think. That is to say, the period between 1965 and 1975. And this was a period in which we went from having roughly 4.5 million students enrolled in colleges, universities in the United States. And in a single decade, we doubled that to close to 9.5 million. And of course, everybody knows, I'm old enough to remember, just barely, maybe all of you are too young to remember, but this was the decade of sort of radical leftism. It took hold on American campuses. And so this was a huge expansion in the number of students and necessarily a huge expansion in the number of professors. So you have a whole generation of professors entering higher education who are indeed not only progressive, as Daniel suggests, but now they've been pushed even further in the direction of leftism. And that generation produced another generation of college professors, and that generation is producing yet more and more students who are following the same ideological lines, only I think more extreme. So that's how we got here. I think between the three of us, we've given something like a 100-year history of ed schools and the radical leftism that they marinate their students in maybe 5 minutes. So pretty good. We didn't plan this, I don't think, either.
And I think what you're describing, all of you, is shifts in the teaching profession. And I was hoping to talk a little bit about that. How have the expectations and norms of the teaching profession changed, perhaps since that Vietnam era, but even before then?
I can keep going with the history. There is, I think, a good example. The Committee of 10, I think it was 1896, brought together by the National Education Association when it was still just kind of a loose association of teachers, convened 10, I mean, they were deans of colleges, professors, some leaders of schools, and I can't remember if there are any teachers in it. They came together. Education at the K-12 level was kind of haphazard. Everybody was just doing all sorts of different things. And they brought together this committee to try and add some logic to it, some coherence to it, see if we could standardize it. So if anybody moved from one state to another, their kid wasn't, being dropped into a completely foreign system that they weren't accustomed to. But what they were talking about is, what topics should the kids be studying? How many years should they be in school? Very, very, very niche, almost nerdy, boring questions about how do we run a school day and what should the kids be learning. Fast forward to, the 2020s, and what is the National Education Association focused on? Hiding gender transitions from parents, making sure that they use their social media to denounce the state of Israel and Trump. Again, I don't know what your opinions are on the state of Israel or Trump, but what does that have to do with the NEA and what's going on in schools, and why is that the focus of the nation's largest teachers union? I think that's kind of emblematic of what are the expectations of teachers, from very focused on reading, writing, and arithmetic almost to a fault where they're not thinking about anything else, to this very, the teacher's role is now almost viewed as a co-conspirator, no longer a steward of our Western tradition, kind of passing it along to the next generation, but these revolutionaries alongside the kids that we're trying to deconstruct all of the evil isms that currently exist.
I look at it. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Brandy. Go ahead, Brandy.
Okay, I was just going to say, I think that in order to really answer the question, which I think Daniel did pretty perfectly, in the role of the teacher, is to also examine what the role of the school is. And I think that that's been, I don't know if this is a chicken or, chicken versus egg question, which one came first, but we can see that the role of the school is transformed. Rather than being a place for learning, a place to produce scholarship, a place for academic engagement, we see a shift where schools are transforming into spaces for activism or political ideology to be shared, and only kind of one-sided political ideology, a place where dissent is more shut down rather than creative disagreement and creative debate being shared. So I think that that's also, as the environment has shifted, the entity, the schoolhouse, it shouldn't be a surprise then that the leader of that environment, the teacher's role, has also shifted into leading the activism and the political hegemony in this space of what's supposed to be a space of learning.
And there is an antipathy in all of this, of course, to content knowledge. I think if you just talk to the average person on the street and you ask them, what's the purpose of schools? Well, it's learning. Learning something that students didn't know before, things that are important, whether it be history, geography, algebra, music, whatever the subject. And I think it would be hard for them to comprehend the reaction of professional educators and teachers who've gone through ed schools, the reaction of those people to that very idea. For them, for at least a portion of them, and especially the people who are teaching in ed schools, knowledge is oppressive. And what they mean by that is that if you have a social order stratified in the way that they imagine the United States is, then that social order must be propped up by systems of oppression. And the systems of oppression are not just economic. Otherwise, if that were the case, we'd already had a revolution. The tendrils must be much deeper and more subtle. And this is why the whole suspicion of knowledge comes about. In other words, there's a logic to what they're thinking. So if you shake your head and walk away, you have not won the debate for them. You have to realize that for them, what we think of as content knowledge, useful tools for getting along and flourishing in this society, are really just shackles that are cleverly disguised. So, and that's not something you can easily argue them out of, because it's not just one little thing that's sitting there by itself that's debatable. It's part of an entire network and ideology. So you're asking them to give up not one idea, but 100 ideas. And so that's really what makes this problem so difficult.
Yeah, our white paper refers to the problem as an ideological operating system that has its tendrils throughout every aspect of the learning environment, which makes it extremely challenging. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Well, I was reminded of, Thomas Kuhn's book on the scientific revolutions. One of the points that Kuhn makes in many of his books is that in some ways it didn't make a lot of sense just to look at what Galileo was seeing through a telescope and then suddenly decide on the basis of this factual evidence that we had a sun-centered a solar system, because that required overthrowing so many other things in your life. It meant, for example, saying goodbye to your religion. It meant saying goodbye to your friends. And I think that has been very useful for me to consider that this is not a matter of factual evidence for people who have been marinating in an operating system. It's really much deeper. It's like trying to talk somebody out of a religion by pointing to a problem in their religious text. It doesn't happen that way. It's a much deeper and more intractable problem than I think we perhaps imagine.
If I can jump in there, I think part of the problem with, I too am my own disciple of E.D. Hirsch. His book, Cultural Literacy, is, I think, the most influential book on education that I've read. Complete paradigm shift for me. I kind of initially ascribed to some of the more progressive nostrums about learning because I didn't know anything else. Again, the dogma of ed schools, it's not that we got a broad reading of ideas and the professors kind of leaned one way. It was, we were only presented with the ideas of Dewey or Paulo Freire and the like. So I never encountered anyone like E.D. Hirsch. I didn't know he existed until I read an op-ed before I was at the American Enterprise Institute with, I read an op-ed from one of the other fellows who's here now. But back to your point, Lyle, the problem with arguing over facts is those who ascribe to a more critical pedagogy idea, taking from Paulo Freire, this idea that schools are supposed to be these centers of social and political activism. It's where we're going to draw the revolution or begin the revolution. If you point out something like, hey, direct instruction actually works really well. In fact, more effectively often than inquiry or discovery learning. Or if you point out that kids have to memorize their phone names, or they have to memorize their math facts in order to be fluent in higher levels of math or more difficult reading, or if you tell them about the basics of cognitive theory, working memory, long-term memory, cognitive load, chunking, automaticity, these things don't matter. Because what is often the evidence that people like myself use to show that something like memorizing math facts is effective? Well, I point to test scores. But the test scores themselves, any kind of measurement is oppressive. They are biased. They are choose your insult. They attack the messenger. So you can't even have that conversation on what's most effective because they're honestly, I think many of them aren't focused on education. They're focused on, like you said, almost this religion that the kids are getting better reading scores or better math scores is almost irrelevant to them It might be wrapped up in more euphonious language. We want to focus on educating the whole child. We want to attack injustices. So it's hard to argue against, because then you're arguing against a platitude, against a euphonious sounding just phrase. But I think when you're saying like you can present them with these facts, well, they don't care about those facts because they're attacking the messenger himself or itself.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, one thing that Hirsch points out, to pick up on your point, and I think it's the most profound insight that he gives us, is that kids who grow up in, middle class and upper middle class homes really don't suffer much from bad schooling in K through 12 schools, because they're getting an education at home. Now, it would be much better if they went to better schools, no question about that. But the people who suffer the most are the people who the progressives on the left pretend to care about the most. But their own policies, because let's take the example of reading. One of Hirsch's points is that children come to school. Let's imagine you're a middle-class kid and your parents have, sort of literate conversations at the dinner table. They all sit down to dinner. They take them to museums. Maybe they give them piano lessons. They have a full range of people who come into the house. They have grandparents, siblings who are reading to them. They are getting an education 24 hours a day, even when they're not in school. The kids who are suffering most are the kids who get zero education unless they are getting it in the school. So the schools really fail a particular group of people, and they fail the people who are marginalized, who are left out, who are disadvantaged economically or racially or whatever the category is. Those are the ones who are being failed the most. And when I have pointed this out to colleagues, by just pointing to, for example, the Oregon State's reading scores, and pointing out that we are now 47th in the nation, and Mississippi is moving up to, I think last time I checked, it was something like 5th. This doesn't seem to even matter to them. I said, does it not matter to you that we are failing children in the most progressive state in the union, while apparently the least progressive state, the state that is mocked, is now making huge gains, and it's making gains precisely because it has changed course, and it changed course because it was forced to, not because anybody decided rationally this is the thing we need to do.
Just to bring us back to ed schools and their role and what we're seeing in K through 12 education. So we're seeing rising extremism, activism on the part of teachers and administrators at the very, at the very youngest ages. I'm curious what you all think the role is of these teachers' programs. Are teachers going into those programs already activists and looking to make a change, or are they becoming activated when they go into teachers' colleges? When they come out?
I think it might be a bit of a mix. I would not be surprised if in more recent years we see teachers' colleges as being more of a draw for individuals who are really looking to be professional activists, mostly because we see the field being presented as scholar activists, that's the role of the teacher, to be a scholar activist. That's going to be a pretty strong recruitment strategy or message for those who are looking to get into professional activism. But I will say, I've encountered a number, numerous individuals who went into the field because they actually wanted to teach kids. And they've been highly disappointed and disgusted that they spent a lot of time and a lot of money going through teacher education programs to walk out of those programs with none of those tools or skills. And they feel like they're failing students. And that really, it kind of gets to the heart of the issue. One, to figure out, okay, if teachers' colleges aren't teaching teachers how to teach, do we need them? What's the point of them existing? And then how do you reverse course and kind of eliminate this idea of the scholar activist being an actual profession that K through 12 kids, minor children, have to then suffer the consequences for? The kids are the guinea pigs in this experiment, and the experiment is harming them first and foremost, which harms our future second.
Yeah, I think Brandy's right there when she says that it's a bit of both. I think the teaching profession kind of, by the nature of the job, draws a lot of, bleeding heart, just pathos dripping individuals that just want to go and help kids. And that also is then going to bring along some activists with them. I'm in the middle of a project. I don't have a finished report written, where I'm doing a bunch of open records requests of these institutions, focusing on the master's degrees, not the undergraduate training, but I think it's either 49 or 51% of teachers have master's degrees, so it's still a large portion of them. Looking at their syllabi, what are the readings that are being assigned? And it's egregious what these teachers are reading, what the professors are presenting as best practice or the research. Queering the curriculum is a common one. Queering this, queering that, queering rural education. To your point earlier, Dana, about reading Judith Butler. So far, I have not seen Judith Butler herself assigned, but many, many works that obviously come from her ideas in gender theory. A lot on critical race theory, which we were assured was not in any way in schools ever and is only in law schools. The guide for white women who teach black boys, hip hop pedagogy, all sorts of Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, who herself was an activist who thought that, or a Marxist who thought that schools should exist to transgress norms and boundaries, said that the nuclear family is a conservative myth and not a safe space. Like, these just radical readings. And it's not, one course. I don't like Paulo Freire. I don't like these theorists. I disagree with them. But if I were to design my own teacher program from ground up, I'd probably include Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I disagree with it. I think it is a disastrously incorrect book, but it's an influential book. But I would set it as next to Edie Hirsch's Cultural Literacy, or the schools that we need. So students are getting exposed to a broad range of ideas. The problem with these programs is they're only including one. So teachers go in and they don't know anything else. They don't know anything other than these kind of fringe ideologies. So even if someone who's a moderate or conservative goes in, if they're moderate compared to that program, I mean, a moderate compared to Trotsky does not a moderate make, so they're coming out, even those who think I'm pretty centrist, they're not. I would argue that they're probably not.
And
I think
it's a pretty smooth transition from college to ed schools. I mean, the fact is, it's not getting better, despite what one may think about, whatever you think of the current political climate. I think a lot of people are hopeful. Where education is concerned, I'm not hopeful, I'm sorry to say, because colleges can only get worse, because anyone who has any conservative leanings whatsoever, and conservative here just now means middle of the road, what used to be a moderate Democrat is now a right-wing conservative. Those people are aging out and have been aging out for 20 years. So that was the only real check on the leftist ideology in colleges and universities. So students graduating from college now, going into ed schools, most of the time, this is all familiar territory to them. So, and they've been marinating in this, again, going back to K through 12, they've been marinating in this nonsense for 20 years at every stage, from elementary school, if you can imagine that, middle school, high school, college. So the transition to ed school is no problem at all for many of them.
Yeah, it's natural that the conversation has been turning to politics, right? Because of the orthodoxy that exists within education schools in particular. I'm curious about, at this time of just abysmal literacy rates and numeracy scores, what are ed schools doing about those things, if anything?
I mean, it doesn't seem like much. I think that the story of the Mississippi Miracle and even Alabama and Louisiana really turning around some pretty decades of horrendous literacy scores for the poorest kids, for Black American kids, has been something that's a little bit hard to ignore in the field of education. And we see certain states trying to kind of, well, we're going to offer phonics-based teacher professional development along with the things that actually haven't been working, the things that have been failing kids. Like there's still been a hesitancy to throw out the tools that haven't been working, likely because of ideological pressure and ideological concerns. And again, to me, the core of this is really getting back to what's the purpose of school. And if the purpose of school is to impart and encourage and spread and create knowledge and scholarship, then we need to focus on how to best do that. If the purpose, and really just say it point blank straight out, the United States has a very, very unique K through 12 education system that isn't really offered in any other country in the world, where American kids have access to 12 or 13 years of free education that is supposed to give them the foundation to graduate high school and become productive members of society, to become citizens, to go into the workforce or go on to higher education. And we have to ask, is our K through 12 system doing that? Is it providing that? And I think right now, overall, it's failing pretty abysmally in that. And so when we think about, well, what's the purpose of ed schools? I think it would be to provide the teachers the tools to carry out their profession, to teach students. It doesn't seem that's happening, at least not teaching them scholarship. If the purpose is to teach them how to be activists, well, it's been pretty successful, I'd say.
For our listeners, Dana, many of them will doubtless know of this organization, but the National Council for Teacher Quality is a really great organization that has a very informative website for just the question you're asking: what are ed schools doing with respect to reading? And I'm just now looking at their webpage called Reading Foundations, and you can find this again at NCTQ. And they will list state by state what the average ed school, and not every ed school cooperates with them for obvious reasons. I think my school, which has an ed school, never answers the questionnaire for obvious reasons. But so far, I just looked at it today, and as of now, only 28% of American ed schools are teaching all 5 of the core foundations for reading instruction. A full 22% aren't teaching any of them. And of course, Oregon is among that group. So if you want to know how your state is doing, and indeed it goes down to the actual school itself, you can go on that site and they will tell you exactly how your state is doing, and give you some ideas about what you can do about it. And that's the best thing, I think, that's come along in quite a while. We owe a lot to Kate Walsh, who has been doing this for 20 years. She retired in 2023, but NCTQ is still doing great work.
Yeah, again, going through a bunch of these ed school syllabi, do you know where whole language and balanced literacy and 3 cueing continues to persist? In schools of education. That's where these theorists are still getting read. Over 10 programs. I think there was 1 book on phonics. So 10 different institutions. 1 of them was on phonics, a handful on whole language. Most of what I've been finding is even in early literacy classes, the focus is on workshop models. So letting kids just pick their own books, and the idea being that if kids are just surrounded with good books, they'll kind of figure out how to read, just like we learn to speak and understand naturally, then kids will learn to read and write naturally, which is not the case. Reading and writing has to be taught. It is not natural in the way that speaking and listening are. But when I'm reading some of these texts and these assigned readings and these syllabi, I'm coming back to a point that I made earlier, that you can point at Mississippi and say that, well, look at what they're doing. They're doing phonics, and they're one of the poorest, if not the poorest state in the country, and yet they're number 5 in reading. It's phonics. Let's do phonics. But that evidence doesn't matter. If you look at the whole language, activists that are still being assigned in these colleges of education, what are they saying? Well, we want to make sure we focus on the whole child. We want to make sure they develop a love of reading. The test scores don't matter because all of this other stuff is more important. I was reading another professor of education just last night had a blog post basically on why we shouldn't care about Mississippi scores because, well, the kids are still poor. Or we don't like the other policies of Mississippi, so we shouldn't be emulating them in education. The test scores just don't matter because the issue isn't the issue. The issue is everything else that they want to focus on.
It's interesting you say that because if the results for the students don't matter, they're actually saying then the students don't matter. And to have people that are supposed to be in, a profession where the students are centered, that is a pretty horrific point of view that test scores don't matter. Like it doesn't matter if these kids are literate or illiterate because we disagree ideologically with some type of politics, which also speaks to the issue of partisanship in education. Like education's not supposed to be about someone's politics or how they vote. It's really just supposed to be about teaching children and expanding scholarship.
Yes, there are plenty of obvious retorts to the kind of arguments from the balanced language theorists that I was presenting, right? We want to help them develop a love of reading. You know what's going to make them love reading more? Being good at it and actually teaching them how to do it. Well, we shouldn't care about Mississippi because we don't like their other politics and they're still a high poverty level. It's like, well, you know what's going to help them get out of poverty? Teaching them to read well. So yeah, there's a lot of retorts there. Just kind of trying to point out what I've been finding and seeing.
No. Well, again, to go back to that earlier point, it's the least equitable treatment of students you can possibly imagine. This idea that, students will develop a love of reading. It's amazing when you go back. I have a book, if you can allow me to present it to you. It's the whole language catalog from 1990s. And I got this off of eBay. It's always good to have the actual book, I think. And this was sort of modeled off the Whole Earth catalog, some of you may remember from the 60s and 70s. And what you get in that book, and it's really just a compendium of anecdotes from people who talk about their own children and how they learn to read. And of course, none of these people seem to recognize that if they are teachers and they've gone to college, they live in a very privileged environment, and that their experience with their children having books and parents and grandparents who are actually teaching them phonics on the side. They don't call it phonics. They call it teaching children to read. They have no conception that theirs is a very unique and fortunate environment in which to raise a child, but that the people who don't have that environment come to school and, as Daniel points out, can't possibly love to read because it's a foreign language to them. If you haven't taught them phonics, if you haven't had a grandparent or a sister or a mother and father who have time to sit down with you with a book for 15 minutes a day, it begins to create a school system that is nothing but frustration for these children. And it's just incomprehensible to me that they can look at these results and continue along the same path. But again, it's a religion. It's really not a rational choice, I think.
So I'd like to move in a moment to talk about some possible solutions to this daunting problem. Before we do, I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about what role outside organizations play, activists, foreign entities, hoping maybe, Brandy, you can tell us a little bit about the larger ecosystem that's shaping even ed schools.
I mean, I think that being an American, it's easy to ignore or maybe not understand just how influential, how important our education system is. There are over 50 million kids in K through 12 education with a population of roughly 330 million. I mean, that's a significant chunk of our population that are going through to a 12 to 13 year process of education where they're spending majority of their waking hours in schools. So if you were thinking of, putting yourself in the shoes of maybe a malign actor who wanted to hurt the United States of America or influence the United States of America or American policy to benefit yourself, putting yourself in that actor's shoes, one of the best and maybe easiest targets would be our education system. So seeing money poured in to bring in certain teacher professional development, certain curricular materials that either can foment some of the kind of partisanship and ideological divides we see happening in our wider society and especially in our schools, to putting in direct curriculum that directly tries to demonize the United States of America or American values and lift up the values of a foreign entity or a malign actor. The schools are a pretty good place to start. And we've seen this in other places before. You look at whether it was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, Soviet Union. We look at what happened in China. We look at Nazi Germany. We look at the Iranian Revolution. A lot of those types of activities started in schools, because if you capture schools, you can capture a nation's future.
So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what we're seeing with some of the activists around teachers' unions, if you're familiar with that, and how that plays into what's going on in K through 12 classrooms and ed schools.
So Daniel brought up the NEA and how they started, which sounded pretty great. And then we look at how they're functioning today, where they're effectively functioning, or so it appears, like a political PAC rather than representing educators. I mean, I think that whether you're pro-union or anti-union, if you think about the function of a union, it should be, or a teachers union, you would hope that it would be to make sure teachers are provided the resources necessary to do their profession, to carry out their professional duties, make sure they're being paid a fair wage, make sure their working environment is safe. I mean, the basics of a union. We're seeing instead of those things, or in addition to those things, maybe teachers unions become highly political, highly partisan, where they're taking a political perspective on a particular subject that has nothing to do with those things, making sure that the teacher has a fair wage, a safe working environment, etc. And with that power, with that political power, it transforms the function of a teachers union. So we've seen NEA involved in foreign policy positions that have nothing to do with K through 12 classroom. And in taking those positions, then perhaps ostracizing some teachers that don't agree with that foreign policy decision, and actually leaving them without representation, without union representation in their places of work. We see other entities. A lot of people think that in the K through 12 classroom, at least, teachers are still teaching from textbooks. That isn't necessarily the case. Teachers pull curricular materials and lessons off of the internet from certain, 501c3 nonprofit organizations that develop and design all sorts of curricular materials. A teacher downloads it, brings it to the classroom, and teaches that rather than a textbook. So our K through 12 system, because it's so standardized, it makes it easy for malign actors to get in those systems and into that system and start pushing a particular narrative or ideology. We've seen this with a lot of the anti-Israel protests and movements and policies, and school boards making certain statements on where they stand on a ceasefire resolution. Again, something that has nothing to do with the K through 12 classroom, and many times doing it under the guise of, well, we want our students, all of our students, to feel safe, or, well, we want to stand on the right side of history, or, well, we want to teach the truth, even if it's a half truth or their opinion. I mean, this is kind of how we're seeing it play out.
So in the short time, go ahead.
Oh,
Please.
I'll be brief because you just said short time left.
I did.
I just want to also talk about the fact that the direction is flowing both ways between teachers, colleges, and these outside organizations. Who staffs the foundations? Who staffs the unions? Who staffs the administration and the bureaucracy? Who goes and works in local governments or the federal government? Graduates of these teacher colleges. So it's more than just the teaching workforce that's coming out of here, but these schools of education are then also staffing all of these other mediating organizations around education. And that's why you see teachers unions. What's the number one concern that shows up for teachers on essentially every survey that I've ever found? It's not pay, it's discipline and behavior. But what stance do the unions take? They're all for, soft on consequence approaches to discipline and doing away with traditional discipline and consequences. That's just one of many, I think, examples where the unions aren't really supporting the teachers because they're staffed with these ideologues. They're staffed with, to use Lyle's word, kind of these religious zealots almost. So as I keep saying, the issue isn't the issue is the revolution. We're going to use all of these other organizations to advance our own ideology and not protect teachers, teach kids to read, whatever the institution is actually supposed to do.
Yeah, I think Daniel did a really good job of explaining what we mean when we say that the system is perpetuating this ideological operating system. It doesn't take any one single person. The ideas have become so institutionalized that they're self-reinforcing. So within that context, what reforms are possible? Short term, long term? What's your opinion?
I can jump in. I think there's kind of the way I see it, there are three avenues for reforming these. There's kind of and I don't know which one's best. And the nice thing about, state control over education is I think different states can experiment with this. We have the libertarian deregulation route where we just don't make attendance at one of these institutions necessary to get licensed or to get a teaching credential, and leave it up to schools, leave it up to local administrators to train the teacher. I was a charter school administrator, and admittedly, I would rather somebody off the street who maybe at least had a bachelor's degree and went through background check, not like a crazy person. But it's easier for me as an administrator to teach somebody in the nuts and bolts of teaching than to try and deprogram a graduate from a school of education. There's little to no evidence that attendance at one of these programs actually makes a better teacher. So let's just do away with them. If we don't outright abolish them, at least get rid of the need to go through one to get a credential or a license. We can try and reform them, lean on state legislatures to just force them to not teach one thing and instead teach another. Florida has tried this a bit. DeSantis has tried this a bit, still yet to see what the results of that are. And I think a third avenue would be to build alternative institutions. One of the most exciting higher ed developments, I think, recently has been the establishment of these civic centers at a lot of universities. There's Arizona State has one, Ohio has one. Probably the one that's gotten the most attention in the media is the Hamilton School at Florida. But doing something similar for teachers' colleges. I'm from the classical education world, so I'd like to see some institutes of classical education, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be just the nuts and bolts of teaching, back to basics, liberal arts education, great books. Pick your term. I'm ecumenical in what we call it. But I think it would be very interesting if a few flagship universities at flagship public universities in red states kind of just said, no, the legislature said you have to start this institution. And we got a handful of professors, perhaps Lyle could be one of them, who aren't bought into this critical theory approach to education, but want to read great books with students, want to help teachers learn how to read great books with students and teach them to read and all of these kinds of things. And I think over time that could be very influential.
I think that,
in addition,
sorry, go ahead, Laura.
Go ahead, Brandy. Well, the one thing we can do, I agree with Daniel 100%. I might just add that in the short term, we should also keep our eye on reading and math scores and also go to NCTQ and see what states are doing. The fact is, as we've said, the teachers, colleges, and the people who run them may not care, but the people who do care are parents. So there really should be, and this is where any administration, I don't care if it's a Trump administration or whatever administration happens to be in power, should be holding states' feet to the fire every time we see these results come out from what is the NAEP, the Nation's Report Card. This should be front and center of any administration's dictates to states, and the states who are at the bottom should be shamed every week. I mean, because again, they may not care, but the parents who have children in these school systems, they do care, and they're wondering why they're paying so much in taxes and getting so little in return. So I think in the short term, that's something we can measure. You can measure actually how well students are doing on these tests. And again, if the institution itself doesn't care, the parents will. So I think that's one thing that really needs to be emphasized a lot more than it currently is.
I agree with everything that Lyle and Daniel said. I'll add one or two other things. One, obviously with my role with FTD, one of the things that we can do, should do, is get foreign influence and funding out of K through 12 education. I think that, Lyle, you mentioned we pay a lot of taxes already that cover the programs that support our K through 12 education system. There's no reason to have foreign funding and influence there, because it leads to other problems that negatively impact our national security. And the other part is, I'll agree again, Daniel, with what you said. I actually think that we should lean more in towards a classical education pedagogy for our K through 12 system, because that's what provides the building blocks necessary. And we know this because it's been done before. At the time of Reconstruction in the United States, the percentage of Black Americans who went from illiteracy to literacy is a growth rate that we haven't really seen since. And in fact, unfortunately, in today's education environment, we're seeing it go in the reverse. And we know what the steps were taken for that segment of the population to become literate, not just literate, but to excel in creating literature and poetry. And we're seeing that reversed right now in the 21st century in the United States. It's insane. And I think that is something that we need to take in consideration. You look at Baltimore, you look at Chicago, you look at Oakland, you look at the whole state of California and these literacy rates. It is abominable. In fact, I think it's criminal.
Well, on that note, I agree. It is criminal. I want to thank you all for your time, for sharing your expertise and your leadership and continuing to work in this area. I'm often reminded in conversations like these of an old Jewish teaching, which is that I might get the translation a little wrong, but we're not required to finish the work, but nor are we permitted to abandon it. So thank you for not abandoning it. Here at Navi, we're going to continue working on it. We have 2 more webinars coming up. Next up is Teaching in the Hostile Classroom, where we'll feature some K through 12 teachers who are working in captured institutions and hear what that's like firsthand. And then that's March 12th. March 17th, we are exploring a possible civic values solution, which asks whether civics education can combat extremism and anti-Semitism in K through 12 schools. And you can find more information about those events on our website. So thank you all again for joining us, Daniel and Lyle and Brandy. Really very much enjoyed the conversation. And we hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Thanks, Brandy and Daniel. Bye.